Our thanks to Matthew Chance for that report. Time now for the exchange. Let's bring in Alina Polyakova. She specializes in Russian foreign policy. Alina, it is good to see you. And it is interesting because it's quite noticeable to see this change in posturing and language and even policy from President Trump towards Russia and Vladimir Putin. But at the same time, I think this 50-day window before leveling new sanctions against Russia has raised some eyebrows, not only from Sergei Lavrov, but for different reasons from even some Republicans in his own party. And Tom Tillis, who has been a big supporter of Donald Trump's, nonetheless announcing that he's going to be retiring early because he spoke out against the recent spending bill, says that this 50-day delay in sanctions in Russia worries him. I'm wondering if you share that concern. What do you make of this deadline that's, a bit longer than many had hoped for?
Well, I think you're certainly right that we have seen a significant shift now, not just on rhetoric, but also on policy from President Trump and the White House on Russia. And I think the main reason for that is that from day one, it was very clear that Putin was and is the main obstacle to having some sort of peace deal in his war against Ukraine. Russia's the aggressor here. And I think the president is showing now that he recognizes that. But at the same time, the positive news, we should give the White House credit for that. But this 50-day timeline you mentioned was a bit odd. In the past, we've seen the president really stick to these 2-week timelines. He often moves those when it comes to tariffs, for example. But that was probably the expectation that many people had or were hoping for. There'd be a much shorter, more of a pressure on Mr. Putin to actually change his calculus. I think the way things currently stand, Russia's accelerating and intensifying attacks on Ukraine are likely to get even worse, because the Kremlin will certainly see this as the time to really get as much territory as they possibly can.
And also, when you think about the fact that, just practically speaking, China and India are two of the largest importers of Russian fossil fuels, China especially, they don't have very much time to reorganize and come up with a plan B. 50 days is not long enough for them to be able to do that. So just practically speaking, obviously Putin is aware of that fact. So it's not as if they're simply going to be able to snap their fingers in, 6 weeks and say, okay, we're not going to buy any more Russian oil and gas. So that part of the puzzle is also problematic too.
Well, you're really talking about this idea of secondary sanctions. President calls it secondary tariffs, but they're secondary sanctions. And what that really means is that the United States has now said, with the president's announcement, that we are going to impose costs on countries that do trade with Russia, which also happen to be some of our largest trade partners, China, India, even Europe is still buying some Russian oil and gas as well. So I think what I want to see in the next weeks is whether the administration will share information about how they're going to act on this threat that we've seen from the president. And the secondary sanctions piece is the big question mark. As you say, that's incredibly complicated. Sanctions enforcement, just direct sanctions enforcement on Russia, has been a big challenge for multiple administrations. Secondary sanctions are multiple times more complicated and difficult than that.
Yeah, and in terms of ultimately deterring Vladimir Putin and really bringing him to the negotiating table in earnest as soon as possible, someone you and I both know and follow closely, Tatiana Stanovaya, says that Putin is not going to sacrifice his goals in Ukraine just to win favor with Donald Trump. Obviously, he would love to have Donald Trump in his corner, but that's not what's going to end this war. Harsh rhetoric from the president. So in your view, what is the easiest, or not the easiest, because there's nothing easy about it, what is the most timely way to bring this war to an end, or at least a ceasefire?
Look, my view has always been that the only way to change Putin's calculus is to apply the maximum pressure possible on him, the individuals around him, the oligarchs that depend on him, as well as the Russian economy. We don't know, of course, if that will change his calculus, or if that will change his behavior. But that is the only way, is to make Russia's war machine more difficult to sustain and impossible to continue to move forward. Russia now is spending almost 8% on its defense, which really is much lower than what the U.S. has been spending, which is around 3.4%, as well as broader NATO allies. The Russian war machine supports Putin's rule. And when we see that, what that means is that it supports the war on Ukraine. So I think the administration, if it makes good on the threats that we saw from President Trump yesterday, if it follows through on secondary sanctions, turns up the pressure, provides significant military support for Ukraine, that is not an easy path, but I think is the only path to bring an end to the war.
All right, Alina Polyakova, good to see you. Thank you so much.